The crowd buzzed with excitement as the royal procession made its way through the city square. Flags waved, music played, and people cheered, their eyes fixed on the gleaming carriages and the stoic royal guards marching beside them. The guards, dressed in their immaculate uniforms, carried rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces unreadable behind their helmets. They were symbols of power and order, untouchable and unshakable. But in the midst of the celebration, one man saw an opportunity. He was a thug, a desperate man with nothing to lose. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, and his eyes burned with a mix of fear and determination. He had been planning this for days, watching the guards, studying their movements. He knew the risks, but he didn't care. He needed that rifle. It was his ticket to survival, his chance to provide for his family. The thought of his starving children back home pushed him forward, drowning out the voice in his head that screamed this was a terrible idea. The thug moved quickly, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. His heart pounded in his chest as he closed in on his target, a royal guard standing at the edge of the procession. The guard was tall and imposing, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm intensity. But the thug didn't notice any of that. All he saw was the rifle. He lunged. The crowd gasped as the thug grabbed the rifle, his fingers closing around the cold metal. For a split second, he thought he had done it. He thought he had won. But then, something happened that he could never have anticipated. The guard didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He didn't even move. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the thugs. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear, just a quiet, almost sad understanding. And then, he reached out. His hand touched the thug's arm, and the world stopped. The thug froze. Not just his body, but everything, his breath, his heartbeat, even his thoughts. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. His eyes widened in terror as he realized what was happening. The guard's touch had done something to him, something impossible. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own body. The crowd fell silent, their cheers turning to murmurs of confusion and fear. They watched as the thug stood there, rigid and unmoving, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The guard stepped back, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. This was no ordinary man. "You've awakened what you cannot control," the guard said softly, his voice carrying an eerie weight. The words sent a chill through the crowd, and they began to back away, their fear palpable. The thug wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but he couldn't. He was helpless, a living statue in the middle of the square. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers. Only questions. Who was this guard? What had he done to him? And most importantly, would he ever be free again? As the royal procession moved on, the crowd began to disperse, leaving the thug alone in the square. The guard gave him one last look, his eyes filled with a strange mix of pity and resolve, before turning and walking away. The thug was left standing there, a silent testament to the power he had dared to challenge. And in that moment, he realized something that filled him with a deep, unshakable dread. This was just the beginning. The royal guard walked away from the square, his boots clicking against the cobblestones with a steady rhythm. The crowd parted before him, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. He ignored them, his mind focused on the task at hand. The frozen thug was no longer his concern. Others would deal with him. His duty was to protect the royal family, and nothing, not even a desperate man with a death wish, could distract him from that. But as he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the moment his hand had touched the thug's arm. He had felt it then, the surge of energy that flowed through him, cold and electric. It was a familiar sensation, one he had experienced countless times before, but it never got easier. Every time he used his power, it reminded him of what he was, and what he had lost. The guard's name was not important. He hadn't used it in years. To the world, he was simply a royal guard, a faceless protector of the crown. But beneath the uniform and the stoic exterior, he was something else entirely. He was a product of science and secrecy, a man who had been reshaped and remade into something more, and less, than human. Years ago, he had been a soldier, a loyal servant of the kingdom. He had fought in wars, seen friends die, and carried the weight of their memories on his shoulders. But when the kingdom faced a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be defeated with bullets and bravery, he had been chosen for something greater. He had volunteered for a program that promised to make him stronger, faster, and more resilient. A program that would turn him into the ultimate weapon. He hadn't known the cost at the time. No one had told him about the experiments, the injections, the endless hours of training that pushed his body and mind to their limits. No one had warned him about the pain, the nightmares, or the loneliness that would follow. By the time he realized what he had signed up for, it was too late. He was no longer just a man. He was something else. The program had given him abilities that defied explanation. He could move faster than the eye could see, strike with the force of a battering ram, and endure injuries that would kill a normal person. But his most powerful, and most dangerous, ability was the one he had used on the thug. With a single touch, he could freeze a person in place, locking their body in a state of suspended animation. It was a power that had saved his life more times than he could count, but it came at a price. Every time he used it, he felt a piece of himself slip away. It was as if the energy he unleashed took something with it, a memory, an emotion, a fragment of his humanity. He had tried to stop using it, to rely on his other abilities instead, but there were times when he had no choice. Like today. The guard reached the palace gates and nodded to the other guards on duty. They didn't speak to him, and he didn't expect them to. They knew what he was, and they kept their distance. He was a weapon, a tool to be used when needed and ignored when not. He had accepted that long ago. But as he made his way to his quarters, he couldn't shake the image of the thug's face. The fear in his eyes, the desperation in his actions, it reminded him of the man he had once been. A man who had fought for survival, who had done things he wasn't proud of to protect the people he loved. The thug wasn't a criminal. He was a victim, just like everyone else. The guard sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. They looked normal, but he knew better. They were the hands of a killer, a monster. He had told himself that his actions were justified, that he was serving a greater good. But deep down, he wondered if that was true. Was he really protecting the kingdom, or was he just perpetuating its cycle of violence and fear? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. But what? As the guard lay down to rest, his thoughts turned to the thug. He wondered what would happen to him, if anyone would be able to reverse the effects of his power. He wondered if the thug had a family, people who depended on him. And he wondered if, in another life, they might have been friends. But those thoughts were dangerous. They made him question his purpose, his loyalty, his very existence. And in his line of work, doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The guard closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the image of the thug's face stayed with him, a silent reminder of the cost of his power, and the humanity he had lost. The frozen thug stood in the square, his body rigid and unmoving. His eyes were wide with terror, but behind that fear was a storm of emotions, regret, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but his mind was alive with memories, each one more painful than the last. His name didn't matter anymore. To the world, he was just a criminal, a thug who had tried to steal a rifle from a royal guard. But once, he had been someone else. Once, he had been a father, a husband, a man who had dreams and hopes for the future. But life had a way of crushing those dreams, of turning good men into desperate ones. He had grown up in the slums of the city, where survival was a daily struggle. His parents had worked themselves to the bone to provide for him, but it was never enough. He had promised himself that he would do better, that he would give his own family a better life. And for a while, it seemed like he might succeed. He had found work as a laborer, hauling bricks and mortar for construction sites. The work was backbreaking, but it paid enough to put food on the table. He had married the love of his life, a kind and gentle woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. Together, they had built a home, a small but warm place filled with laughter and love. And then, they had welcomed their first child, a beautiful, bright-eyed boy who had filled their lives with joy. But happiness was a fragile thing, and it didn't take much to shatter it. The first blow came when the construction company he worked for went bankrupt. Overnight, he was out of a job, with no savings to fall back on. He searched for work, but jobs were scarce, and employers were quick to turn him away. Desperate, he took on odd jobs, cleaning gutters, repairing roofs, anything that would put a few coins in his pocket. But it wasn't enough. The bills piled up, and the debts grew heavier. Then came the second blow. His wife fell ill, a fever that left her weak and bedridden. He sold everything they had to pay for her medicine, but it wasn't enough. The doctors said she needed more treatment they couldn't afford. He begged and pleaded, but no one would help him. In the end, he watched helplessly as the light in her eyes faded, leaving him alone with their son. The grief was unbearable, but he couldn't give up. He had a child to care for, a little boy who depended on him. He worked harder than ever, taking on any job he could find, no matter how dangerous or degrading. But it was never enough. The city was cruel, and it seemed determined to break him. And then, one day, he reached his breaking point. His son had been sick for weeks, coughing and wheezing, his small body racked with fever. He had tried everything, home remedies, herbal teas, prayers, but nothing worked. He needed medicine, real medicine, and that cost money. Money he didn't have. That was when he saw the royal procession. The guards with their rifles, the crowd with their coins and jewels, it was like a slap in the face. How could they have so much, when he had nothing? How could they live in luxury while his son lay dying? The anger had burned through him, hot and blinding. He didn't think, didn't plan. He just acted. He saw the rifle, and he saw a way out. If he could sell it, he could buy the medicine his son needed. It was a stupid, reckless plan, but he was past caring. He was desperate. And now, here he was, frozen in place, his body a prison. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but his mind was screaming. He thought of his son, alone and sick, waiting for a father who might never return. He thought of his wife, her face pale and lifeless, and the promises he had made to her. He had failed them both. Tears welled up in his eyes, but they couldn't fall. He was trapped, helpless, and the weight of his failure pressed down on him like a stone. He wanted to scream, to beg for another chance, but he couldn't. All he could do was stand there, a silent statue in the square. As the world moved on without him, the frozen thug was taken from the square under the cover of darkness. A black van pulled up, its windows tinted and its engine silent. Men in unmarked uniforms stepped out, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with precision, loading the thug's rigid body into the van as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The few bystanders who saw the scene quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. In this city, it was safer to mind your own business. The van drove through the empty streets, leaving the city behind and heading into the countryside. After an hour, it reached a high-walled compound, its gates guarded by armed men and surveillance cameras. The van was waved through, and it came to a stop in front of a nondescript building. The men unloaded the thug and carried him inside, down a series of dimly lit corridors, until they reached a laboratory. The lab was a cold, sterile place, filled with machines and monitors. Scientists in white coats moved about, their faces grim and focused. In the center of the room was a large glass chamber, its walls lined with wires and tubes. The thug was placed inside, his frozen body propped upright like a mannequin. A man in a suit watched from the shadows, his hands clasped behind his back. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He didn't speak, but his presence commanded attention. The scientists worked quickly, attaching sensors to the thug's body and monitoring the readings on their screens. "Fascinating," one of the scientists murmured, adjusting his glasses. The subject's cellular activity has been completely suspended. No heartbeat, no brain activity, yet he's still alive. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the thug. "And the cause?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. "It's the energy signature," the scientist replied, pointing to a graph on the screen. "It matches the readings we've seen from Subject 0. There's no doubt, this was his doing." The man in the suit nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "So, our royal guard has been busy," he said. "I wonder what prompted him to use his power so carelessly." "Should we retrieve him?" another scientist asked. "Not yet," the man in the suit replied. "Let him think he's still in control. For now, we focus on the subject. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." The scientists returned to their work, their voices low and urgent. The man in the suit watched for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his mind already racing with possibilities. Meanwhile, in the city, the royal guard sat alone in his quarters, staring at the wall. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The thug's frozen state should have been temporary, a few hours at most. But it had been a full day, and there had been no change. He had tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that the thug was just another criminal who had gotten what he deserved. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen the fear in the thug's eyes, the desperation in his actions. He had felt the energy surge through him when he touched the man, stronger and more volatile than ever before. Something had changed, something he didn't understand. And it scared him. The guard stood and began to pace, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to turn. The program that had created him was shrouded in secrecy, its true purpose known only to a select few. He had always followed orders without question, trusting that his superiors knew what they were doing. But now, for the first time, he began to wonder. What if they didn't? What if he was just a pawn in a game he didn't understand? The thought was like a spark, igniting a fire in his chest. He couldn't ignore it, couldn't push it aside. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. In the lab, the scientists continued their work, unaware of the guard's growing doubts. They injected the thug with various substances, trying to reverse the effects of the guard's power. But nothing worked. The thug remained frozen, his body a mystery they couldn't solve. "It's no use," one of the scientists said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're missing something. We need Subject 0. The man in the suit reappeared, his expression calm and composed. "Patience," he said. "We'll get what we need. In the meantime, keep working. This subject is more important than you realize." The scientists nodded and returned to their tasks, their movements quick and efficient. The man in the suit watched them for a moment, then turned and left the lab, his mind already planning the next move. The royal guard couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and doubts, each one more unsettling than the last. He had always been loyal, always followed orders without hesitation. But now, for the first time, he felt a crack in that loyalty. The image of the frozen thug haunted him, a constant reminder of the power he wielded, and the cost of using it. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clenched into fists. The program that had created him had always been shrouded in secrecy. He had been told that his abilities were a gift, a way to serve the kingdom and protect the innocent. But now, he wasn't so sure. What if his powers weren't a gift? What if they were a curse? The guard stood and began to pace, his thoughts racing. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to turn. His superiors would never tell him the truth. They would only feed him more lies, more justifications. No, if he wanted the truth, he would have to find it himself. He made his decision quickly, without hesitation. He would go to the lab where the thug was being held. He would see for himself what they were doing to the man, and maybe, just maybe, he would find the answers he was looking for. The compound was heavily guarded, but the royal guard knew how to move without being seen. He had been trained to infiltrate enemy lines, to slip past defenses unnoticed. It was almost too easy. He avoided the cameras, disabled the alarms, and took out the guards with swift, silent precision. Within minutes, he was inside. The lab was exactly as he had imagined, cold, sterile, and filled with machines. He moved through the shadows, his eyes scanning the room. And then he saw it. The thug was in a glass chamber, his body still frozen, his face a mask of terror. Wires and tubes were attached to him, and monitors displayed readings that made no sense to the guard. Scientists moved around the chamber, their faces grim and focused. The guard's heart sank. He had known, on some level, that this was happening. But seeing it with his own eyes was different. It made it real. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the scientists. They froze, their eyes wide with fear. One of them reached for a phone, but the guard was faster. He crossed the room in a flash, his hand closing around the scientist's wrist. "Don't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want answers." The scientists exchanged nervous glances, but none of them spoke. The guard sighed and released the scientist's wrist. "What are you doing to him?" he asked, gesturing to the thug. One of the scientists, a woman with sharp features and cold eyes, stepped forward. "We're trying to reverse the effects of your power," she said. "But it's not working. Whatever you did to him, it's beyond our understanding." The guard frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated, then gestured to the monitors. "Look for yourself." The guard stepped closer, his eyes scanning the readings. He didn't understand the numbers, but he could see the patterns, the anomalies. The thug's body was in a state of suspended animation, but it wasn't just frozen. It was changing, evolving. "What's happening to him?" the guard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. "We don't know. But whatever it is, it's not natural. Your power, it's doing something to him. Something we can't control." The guard's mind raced. He had always known that his powers were dangerous, but he had never imagined this. If his touch could do this to a person, what else was it capable of? And what did that mean for him? He turned back to the thug, his heart heavy with guilt. This man, this desperate father, had only been trying to survive. And now, because of him, he was trapped in a nightmare. The guard made his decision quickly. He couldn't leave the thug here, not like this. He had to fix what he had done, no matter the cost. "Step aside," he said, his voice firm. The scientists hesitated, but the guard's expression left no room for argument. They moved away from the chamber, their eyes wide with fear. The guard stepped forward and placed his hand on the glass. He closed his eyes and focused, reaching deep within himself for the energy that had caused all of this. He could feel it, cold and electric, pulsing beneath his skin. He took a deep breath and let it flow through him, into the glass, into the thug. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, the thug's body began to tremble. His eyes flickered, and his chest rose and fell as he took a deep, shuddering breath. The monitors went wild, their readings spiking and crashing as the thug's body returned to life. The guard stepped back, his heart pounding. He had done it. He had reversed the effects of his power. But at what cost? The thug collapsed to the floor, his body weak and trembling. He looked up at the guard, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The guard knelt beside him, his expression grim. "I'll explain later," he said. "Right now, we need to get out of here." The thug nodded, too weak to argue. The guard helped him to his feet and supported him as they made their way to the door. The scientists watched in silence, too stunned to stop them. As they stepped into the night, the guard felt a strange sense of relief. He had taken the first step toward redemption. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The shadowy organization wouldn't let them go so easily. They would come after them, and when they did, the guard would be ready. The guard and the thug moved through the night, their footsteps quick and silent. The thug was still weak, his body trembling from the effects of the guard's power, but he pushed himself to keep up. He didn't know where they were going, but he trusted the guard. After everything that had happened, he had no one else to turn to. The guard led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a place he had used before, a safe house where he could regroup and plan. He helped the thug inside and closed the door behind them, sealing out the cold night air. The thug collapsed onto a makeshift bed, his breathing ragged. What happened to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard hesitated, then sat down beside him. "I used my power on you," he said. "It's complicated. But the short version is that I froze you in place. I didn't mean for it to last this long. I didn't know it could." The thug's eyes widened. "Your power? What are you talking about?" The guard sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not like other people," he said. "I was part of an experiment, a program designed to create soldiers with special abilities. They gave me powers, but they didn't tell me the cost. Every time I use them, I lose a piece of myself. And now, because of me, you've been caught up in this mess." The thug stared at him, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "So, you're some kind of super soldier?" he asked. "Something like that," the guard replied. "But it's not as glamorous as it sounds. The people who created me, they're not good people. They don't care about the kingdom or the people in it. They only care about power. And now, because of what happened to you, they're going to come after us." The thug's face paled. "What do you mean, what happened to me?" The guard hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on the thug's arm. He closed his eyes and focused, letting his energy flow through him. The thug gasped as a strange sensation spread through his body, warm and tingling. And then, something happened that neither of them expected. The thug's body began to glow, a faint, golden light that pulsed with his heartbeat. He looked down at his hands, his eyes wide with shock. What is this?" he asked. The guard pulled his hand away, his expression grim. "It's my power," he said. "But it's not just mine anymore. When I touched you, something happened. My energy, it merged with yours. It's changing you, transforming you into something else." The thug's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "You mean I'm like you now?" "Not exactly," the guard replied. "Your body is reacting differently. It's adapting to the energy in ways I don't understand. But one thing is clear, you're not just a normal person anymore. And that makes you dangerous to them." The thug's heart sank. He had only wanted to survive, to provide for his family. And now, he was caught up in something far beyond his understanding. "What do we do now?" he asked. The guard stood and began to pace, his mind racing. "We need to find out more about the program," he said. "We need to know what they're really planning. And to do that, we need to go back to the beginning." "The beginning?" the thug asked. The guard nodded. "The facility where they created me. It's hidden, but I know where it is. If we can get inside, we might find the answers we're looking for." The thug hesitated, then nodded. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing, he couldn't go back to his old life. Not after this. "All right," he said. "I'm in." The guard gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I promise, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." The thug nodded, but his mind was still reeling. He looked down at his hands, the golden light fading but still visible. He didn't know what was happening to him, but he knew one thing, he couldn't ignore it. He had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in the shadowy organization's headquarters, the man in the suit watched the footage from the lab, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. The guard and the thug had escaped, and that was a problem. But it was also an opportunity. "Prepare the team," he said to the scientist standing beside him. "I want them found and brought back. Alive." The scientist nodded and hurried away, leaving the man in the suit alone with his thoughts. He stared at the screen, his mind racing with possibilities. The guard had always been a valuable asset, but now, with the thug's transformation, he had become something more. Something extraordinary. And the man in the suit intended to use that to his advantage. The guard and the thug moved through the dense forest, their footsteps quick and silent. The facility was hidden deep in the wilderness, far from prying eyes. The guard led the way, his senses heightened, his body tense with anticipation. He knew what they were walking into. He had been here before, and the memories were anything but pleasant. The thug followed close behind, his body still weak, but his determination unwavering. The golden light that had appeared earlier was gone, but he could still feel it, a faint warmth in his chest. It was a constant reminder of what he had become, and what was at stake. As they approached the facility, the guard held up a hand, signaling for the thug to stop. They crouched behind a tree, their eyes scanning the area. The facility was a massive, windowless building surrounded by high fences and armed guards. Cameras were mounted on every corner, their lenses glinting in the moonlight. "This is it," the guard whispered. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." The thug nodded, his heart pounding. "What's the plan?" The guard hesitated, then said, "We go in fast and quiet. We find the control room, shut down the security systems, and get the information we need. Then we get out." The thug nodded again, but his mind was racing. He had never done anything like this before. He was just a desperate man who had made a mistake. But now, he was part of something much bigger. And he couldn't let the guard down. They moved quickly, using the shadows to their advantage. The guard took out the guards with swift, silent precision, his movements almost too fast to see. The thug followed close behind, his heart pounding with every step. They reached the fence, and the guard used his power to melt through the metal, creating a hole just big enough for them to slip through. Inside the facility, the air was cold and sterile. The walls were lined with monitors and wires, and the faint hum of machinery filled the air. The guard led the way, his senses on high alert. He knew the layout of the facility like the back of his hand, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. They reached the control room, and the guard quickly disabled the security systems. The thug watched in awe as the guard worked, his movements quick and efficient. He had never seen anyone like him before. "We don't have much time," the guard said, his voice low. "They'll know we're here soon." The thug nodded and began searching the room for anything that could help them. He found a set of files and quickly began flipping through them. What he saw made his blood run cold. The files were filled with information about the program, about the experiments they had conducted, and the people they had used. There were photos of the guard, of other soldiers like him, and of people who hadn't survived the experiments. And then, there were files about the thug himself. "Look at this," the thug said, his voice trembling. The guard took the files and quickly scanned them. His expression darkened as he read. "They knew about you," he said. "They've been watching you for a long time. They wanted to see what would happen if my power interacted with a normal person." The thug's heart sank. "So, this was all a test?" The guard nodded, his expression grim. "They've been using us from the beginning. And now, they're going to pay for it." Before they could say anything else, the door to the control room burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. The guard reacted quickly, using his power to freeze them in place. But more men were coming, and they were running out of time. "We need to go," the guard said, his voice urgent. The thug nodded and grabbed the files, stuffing them into a bag. They ran out of the control room and down the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. The guard led the way, his senses heightened, his body tense with anticipation. They reached the exit, but it was blocked by more armed men. The guard didn't hesitate. He charged forward, using his power to take them out one by one. The thug followed close behind, his heart pounding with every step. As they fought their way through the facility, the thug began to feel something strange. The warmth in his chest was growing stronger, and he could feel a strange energy building inside him. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore it. They reached the main entrance, but it was locked. The guard tried to use his power to break it open, but it was too strong. The thug stepped forward, his body glowing with a faint, golden light. He placed his hand on the door, and with a surge of energy, it shattered into pieces. The guard stared at him, his eyes wide with shock. What was that? The thug shook his head, his mind reeling. I don't know. But I think I'm changing. The guard nodded, his expression grim. We'll figure it out. But first, we need to get out of here. They ran out of the facility and into the night, the sound of alarms echoing behind them. The guard led the way, his senses on high alert. They had the information they needed, but they were far from safe. As they disappeared into the forest, the thug couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had uncovered the truth, but the fight was far from over. The guard and the thug moved through the forest, their footsteps quick and silent. The facility was far behind them, but the danger was far from over. The thug could feel the energy inside him growing stronger, a strange, pulsating warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. They reached a small clearing and stopped to rest. The thug collapsed onto a fallen log, his breathing ragged. He looked down at his hands, which were glowing faintly with a golden light. What's happening to me? He asked, his voice trembling. The guard sat down beside him, his expression grim. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, it's connected to my power. When I touched you, something changed. My energy merged with yours, and now you're evolving. The thug's heart sank. Evolving? Into what? The guard hesitated, then said, I don't know. But whatever you're becoming, it's powerful. And it's dangerous. The thug stared at him, his mind racing. He had always been a simple man, a laborer trying to provide for his family. And now, he was something else entirely. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him was terrified, but another part was excited. The energy inside him was intoxicating, a surge of power he had never felt before. But at what cost? The guard placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. I know this is a lot to take in, he said. But you're not alone. We'll figure this out together. The thug nodded, but his mind was still reeling. He thought of his son, alone and sick, waiting for a father who might never return. He thought of his wife, her face pale and lifeless, and the promises he had made to her. He had failed them both, and now, he was changing into something he didn't understand. What if I can't control it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard hesitated, then said, You will. You're stronger than you think. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way. The thug nodded, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't go back. He had to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in the shadowy organization's headquarters, the man in the suit watched the footage from the facility, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. The guard and the thug had escaped, and that was a problem. But it was also an opportunity. Prepare the team, he said to the scientist standing beside him. I want them found and brought back. Alive. The scientist nodded and hurried away, leaving the man in the suit alone with his thoughts. He stared at the screen, his mind racing with possibilities. The guard had always been a valuable asset, but now, with the thug's transformation, he had become something more. Something extraordinary. And the man in the suit intended to use that to his advantage. The guard and the thug continued through the forest, their footsteps quick and silent. The thug could feel the energy inside him growing stronger, a strange, pulsating warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. They reached a small clearing and stopped to rest. The thug collapsed onto a fallen log, his breathing ragged. He looked down at his hands, which were glowing faintly with a golden light. "What's happening to me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The guard sat down beside him, his expression grim. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, it's connected to my power. When I touched you, something changed. My energy merged with yours, and now you're evolving." The thug's heart sank. "Evolving? Into what?" The guard hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But whatever you're becoming, it's powerful. And it's dangerous." The thug stared at him, his mind racing. He had always been a simple man, a laborer trying to provide for his family. And now, he was something else entirely. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him was terrified, but another part was excited. The energy inside him was intoxicating, a surge of power he had never felt before. But at what cost? The guard placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said. "But you're not alone. We'll figure this out together." The thug nodded, but his mind was still reeling. He thought of his son, alone and sick, waiting for a father who might never return. He thought of his wife, her face pale and lifeless, and the promises he had made to her. He had failed them both, and now, he was changing into something he didn't understand. "What if I can't control it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard hesitated, then said, "You will. You're stronger than you think. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." The thug nodded, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't go back. He had to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. The guard and the thug stood at the edge of the forest, looking out at the city in the distance. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the skyline. It was a new day, but the fight was far from over. The shadowy organization was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But the guard and the thug were ready. The thug looked down at his hands, which were no longer glowing but still tingled with energy. He had spent the night practicing, learning to control the power that had awakened inside him. It wasn't easy, but with the guard's help, he was starting to understand it. He still didn't know what he was becoming, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had accepted it, embraced it, and now, he was ready to use it. The guard watched him, his expression a mix of pride and concern. He had seen the thug's transformation, and he knew what it meant. The thug was no longer just a desperate man trying to survive. He was something more, something extraordinary. And the guard knew that together, they could face whatever came next. "Are you ready?" the guard asked, his voice calm but firm. The thug nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready." They moved quickly, their footsteps silent but purposeful. They had a plan, and they were determined to see it through. They would confront the shadowy organization, expose their secrets, and put an end to their experiments. It was a dangerous mission, but they had no other choice. As they approached the organization's headquarters, the guard felt a surge of energy, a familiar coldness that spread through his body. He knew what it meant. The organization had sensed their presence, and they were preparing for a fight. The guard and the thug exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with resolve. They knew what they had to do. They charged forward, their movements quick and precise. The guard used his power to freeze the guards in their tracks, while the thug unleashed his newfound abilities, a surge of golden energy that shattered the doors and sent the remaining guards flying. They fought their way through the facility, their bond growing stronger with every step. The guards' precision and the thug's raw power made them an unstoppable team, and they quickly reached the heart of the organization. The man in the suit was waiting for them, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "But you're too late. The program is already in motion. There's nothing you can do to stop it." The guard stepped forward, his eyes filled with anger. "You've used us, manipulated us, and destroyed countless lives. But it ends here." The man in the suit smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You think you can stop me? You're just a tool, a weapon. And weapons don't get to choose their fate. The thug stepped forward, his body glowing with golden light. "We're not weapons," he said, his voice firm. "We're people. And we choose our own fate." The man in the suit's smile faltered, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He reached for a button on his desk, but the guard was faster. He used his power to freeze the man in place, his body rigid and unmoving. The thug stepped forward and placed his hand on the man's chest, a surge of golden energy flowing through him. The man's eyes widened in terror as the energy spread through his body, freezing him in place. The guard and the thug exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with resolve. They had done it. They had stopped the organization and exposed their secrets. But they knew that their fight wasn't over. There were still others out there, others who would try to use them for their own gain. But they were ready. As they walked out of the facility, the sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over the city. The guard and the thug stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced their greatest challenge and come out victorious, but they knew that their journey was far from over. The thug looked down at his hands, which were no longer glowing but still tingled with energy. He thought of his son, alone and sick, waiting for a father who had finally found his way home. He thought of his wife, her face pale and lifeless, and the promises he had made to her. He had failed them once, but he wouldn't fail them again. The guard placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. "You've come a long way," he said. "And I'm proud of you." The thug nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." The guard smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "We're in this together," he said. "And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." The thug nodded, his heart filled with hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was no longer afraid. He had found his strength, his purpose, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As they walked into the sunrise, the guard and the thug knew that their journey was far from over. But they also knew that they had each other, and that was enough.